So please let me introduce Sharath Mahendran. You know him as the creator of the YouTube channel Building Beautifully, which has over 44,000 subscribers. He's a civil engineering student, and his content is one of Sydney's go-to channels for transport, planning and housing. Sharath spoke recently at the TEDx Sydney Youth Festival, and he will be talking about Australia's car addiction and how it's holding our cities back and how public transport can save us.
All right, thank you, Andrea. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be, pretty much what Andrea said. I'm going to be talking about car addiction. I don't really know if I can how much I can interact with the audience, but pretty much, you all know, you all live, as far as I know, most of you live in Australia, and you know that our country is very, very heavily designed around driving. And of course, this is a WePlanet. This is WePlanet's all about the environment, and we all know that this car addiction has quite significant implications on the environment, which I will be touching on a bit later. However, there are other implications that I think are pretty relevant, and I think we'll be discussing those as well. But before that, like, who am I? I think Andrew's already given me a good introduction, but if you don't know me, feel free to scan that QR code with your phone, and you can check out my YouTube channel, which is right there. And I do a lot of videos pretty much just about transport and urban planning and housing and all sorts of issues like that. Most recently, I've been focusing a lot on the Sydney Metro, which I'm sure many of the Sydney-siders attending have already ridden on. It's a simply amazing piece of public transport, and I think it's the type of thing that we should be advocating for more of. But moving on, so pretty much I grew up in a very car-dependent area. I'm here right now, actually. I'm still living at home. So it's West Pennant Hills, which is in the Hills District. It's in the northwest of Sydney. Very much largely came to be around the late 1980s, I believe. One moment, sorry. Very much came to be around the late 1980s, and you may or may not know that this was a very car-dependent era of urban planning, not just in Australia, but especially around the world. Very little in the way of public transport investment back then. So what that means is pretty much everything in my area is designed for the sole purpose of driving. It's designed with the singular assumption that people will drive to the shops, people will drive to school, people will drive to work, and more like that. And I will always be grateful for the childhood that I enjoyed. I recognize that I enjoyed a very privileged childhood, growing up in Sydney, growing up in a house, growing up with loving parents, etc., etc. But there are certain aspects of growing up in urban sprawl that I feel definitely impacted my childhood in ways that I kind of only realize in retrospect, like things that you don't really realize when you're a child. For example, I never really saw my friends outside of school because we all lived far away. I had friends who lived in Kellyville, Bella Vista, Eastwood, just kind of like all over the place. These aren't places you can just easily walk to. And even if they were far away places, like, that's fine, but you can't easily get to those places by public transport either. And what is the one thing that kids can't do? They can't drive. Kids cannot drive a car until, they're pretty much like 16. So that pretty much holds kids back for quite a lot of their lives. And pretty much means that they are at the whims of whatever their parents want them to do. So, we've heard all about Anthony Albanese's social media ban, why kids aren't going out and hanging out on the streets and all of that type of thing. But I reckon urban sprawl definitely plays a big factor in that. I think it's a very underrated and very hidden demon that people don't realize is affecting the way that children grow up. It's not all just social media, I guess is my point. I also never really went anywhere after school because I just got driven to school and I just got driven home. So it pretty much just meant very little in the way of autonomy. So let's just look at some of the facts. So 91% of Australian households own at least one car. 55% own at least two cars. That's quite large numbers there. So there are only 9% of Australian households that don't own a car. And we all know where those places are. These are the places like in the city, in the CBDs where people don't own a car because they already live in very convenient areas, and pretty much everyone else lives in just these very inconvenient places where you pretty much have to drive. Driving is very popular in Australia because of an ingrained culture and because of perceptions of freedom. And I do want to make something really clear here, which is that I don't hate cars and I don't hate driving because I actually quite like driving. It's just in certain contexts. It's like how you wouldn't go for a hike every single day of your life. Imagine that. That would be pretty miserable. But you would go for hikes on the weekend, just for fun, just to kind of get some fresh air. I see driving as something like that. It's kind of something that should be a bit more leisurely, should be a bit more, let's go for a drive for the weekend, but it's instead become this thing that everyone does every single day, which kind of takes the fun out of it. Driving on a quiet road is fun. Driving in traffic is just miserable. So I guess I just wanted to kind of, preface that. Um, and there are, a lot of benefits to driving. I mean, like you look at the countryside, like you wouldn't be able to live in like some of the most remote towns of Australia if it weren't for cars. So it very much helps remote, regional, and rural communities. So by no means should we be just eliminating cars altogether. However, our over-reliance is something that is costing Australians dearly. It costs the average Australian household $435 a week to drive, which I just frankly think is an outrageous amount of money. That is like, that's a week of rent. I mean, like maybe not in Sydney anymore, sadly, but certainly in some Australian cities, that is a week of rent right there. There's also the environment, which I'm going to get to in a moment. I think the most tragic statistic and most tragic fact is that so many people die on our roads. An outrageous number of people died. 1,266 people died on our roads last year. And I just don't think we truly recognize or appreciate just how many people that is. If all those people died in one day, in some sort of disaster, I can promise you that would be the dominating headline for like 10 months after that. If that many people died from a freak accident, a plane crash, a train crash, something unusual, I promise you, we would be talking about that for months. But because it happens on cars, because it happens over the course of a year, because we are just so used to it, we don't really recognize just how disturbing that fact is. 1,266 people. I'm sorry, but that is something that we really need to be addressing as a nation. And we need to be accepting more and more. As difficult as it is to accept this, we need to accept that driving is dangerous. And so long as you have people driving every single day to work, home, out, wherever it is, driving's always going to be dangerous. So it's about reducing that reliance, I reckon. Now, so let's look at the environment a bit now. In 2022, the transport sector made up 19% of Australia's total emissions, and of this, driving is 60%. Of this, driving is 60% of those. So it's a bit confusing. Driving is 60% of that 19%, which is to say that driving is more than 10% of our total emissions. That is not a insignificant number. That's quite a bit of our emissions. And we all know when we're slowly trying to move towards net zero and all of that, that we're not doing fast enough when it comes to driving. Because without intervention, the transport sector is projected to be Australia's largest source of emissions by 2030. Now, electric vehicles are often seen as the solution. I actually spoke about it at last year's WePlanet conference, and I pretty much echoed this exact sentiment, which is that electric vehicles should not be the only solution here. Like, we should not just be looking at electric vehicles. I think, yeah, here we go. So here's why. So the reason why we should not just be using electric vehicles is because it fails to address the problem that is urban sprawl. So just by replacing cars with electric vehicles, you're not addressing the root problem here, which is what I was talking about at the start, which is urban sprawl. Urban sprawl costs the economy $75,000 more per home than just building infill housing. It pushes people further and further away from jobs, schools, opportunities, from these established areas. It's pushing them further away from their families, from their friends, from pretty much everyone, just because, just because that's what that's the Australian dream, which I'm going to get to, so I probably won't touch on that yet. it encourages sedentary behaviors. So just using electric vehicles means that, you're just sitting in a car all day. It doesn't do anything to address that. It limits social cohesion as well, and it causes us to build in increasingly unsustainable areas. I'm talking floodplains. I talked about this last year as well. When you're building in places like Windsor and Richmond, these are places like Box Hill, Riverston, all of that. These are floodplains. These are places that regularly flood. But heaven forbid we build some apartments in the east of Sydney. No, it's better that we build on floodplains. At least that's what some people would tell you. So I guess my takeaway here, electric vehicles are brilliant. Electric vehicles definitely, we definitely need to be shifting to electric vehicles, but they are not the only solution. They are not the solution to the crisis that is at hand right now. And I guess they will help with the environment. So to be completely clear, of course, this is an environmental conference, so they do address that, but there's just so much more that needs to be addressed. So with that, I'm just going to take a quick drink. I'm a bit thirsty, but you can have a look at those slides in the meantime. Public transport is cheaper, more convenient, more comfortable, less frustrating, and better for the environment. I admit some of those are subjective. The less frustrating one is a bit of a subjective one, but for the most part, those things are true. The Opal travel cap in Sydney is only $50 a week. That's a lot cheaper than $435. I don't know about you. It also allows you to do a lot more things on public transport. So when you're driving a car, you can't just get out your laptop and watch, or get out your phone and watch some YouTube, get out your laptop and finish an email, or, do some uni work. You can't do those things when you're driving. You can when you are on a train or when you are on a bus. You can message your friends. You can call your friends. There's so much you can do on public transport. And I think this point applies more to older generations. I feel that didn't necessarily have iPhones and iPads and stuff like that when they used to use public transport more, and I feel that is definitely a very new benefit of public transport that hasn't always been around. Has been now you can just pull out a movie and watch it on the train. I think that's a very important thing. It encourages active behaviors as well, because of course most people need to walk to the local train station. I need to walk to my local bus stop. I don't drive there. It improves social cohesion as well, which I'm going to kind of get to a little bit more later. And I've got a nice picture of the Sydney Metro there. We all know how amazing that thing is. Now, the thing is that we as a country, despite all these benefits, we spent 5 times less on rail than we did on roads in 2020 to 21 in that financial year. So we very much are like quite dedicated to our roads. We spend quite a bit more on them. So we're not really doing enough to address the problem that is car dependency. It is holding our cities back. It is impacting the environment. It is impacting social cohesion. It is impacting the housing crisis. There's just so much that is being caused by car dependency. And another important thing, and I think this very much leads into my social cohesion point. Well, which of these do you think is located next to a train station with services every 15 minutes in peak hour? So pretty much we have this really low density, just sprawling single family detached housing. And then we have these really, this is much more ideal. We have nice dense apartments, good like 20 stories tall. And yet it will shock you which one of these is next to a train station. It is the one on the left. So this is Denniston. This is Carlingford. Carlingford does not have a train station. Carlingford only has a light rail, which is just kind of like out of view there. And it's not even open yet. Whereas Denniston actually has a train station straight to the city, yet this is the type of housing that they have around it. And yeah, you might have noticed the apartments in the background, but that's actually West Ryde. That's not Denniston. So that is another thing that is causing is that it's just entrenching car dependency, exacerbating the housing crisis, and just making everything a lot worse, is the fact that when it comes to trying to solve the housing crisis, we'd rather build apartments in an area that is maybe less desirable, that or doesn't really have a train station, doesn't really have an entrenched affluent population, than build it in a place like Denniston, which has a train station pretty much ripe for the picking and perfect for some densification, yet we'd prefer to do it here. Now, to be clear, Carlingford is a great place to be putting some apartments because there's a light rail stop there. I'm not saying that we don't put the apartments there. I guess what I'm trying to say is, why not both? Why are the apartments being prioritized around a light rail stop and not around a train station? I think that's the point I'm trying to make. And that is just poor land use, quite frankly. Because the truth is, Sydney just has so many opportunities for better urban planning, better transit-oriented development. There are so many stations, 180 train stations all around Sydney, where we can be building more apartments, building more townhouses, densifying on brownfield sites, and just making it easier for people to actually take public transport to work. Now, of course, we can't build around every single station. I mean, these stations up near Richmond are floodplains. I'm not suggesting that we put apartments up at Vineyard and let them all get flooded. Same with East Hills. There are exceptions all over this map, but there are also so many places that we can be building. Look at Waterloo and Crow's Nest as two perfect examples, tucked away over here. Those both just opened with the Sydney Metro City and Southwest project. And, these are the types of places that people want to live. I promise you, if you sell an apartment there's a very low chance that the person who buys that apartment is going to be driving everywhere. They're not going to be driving out to Penrith every day. They are going to be taking the metro to the city and then taking the train to Penrith, or taking the metro to Bankstown, or taking the train to Hurstville, wherever it is they walk. That is why we got to be building around stations. And I do suspect I'm probably preaching to the choir here. I'm sure many of you recognize the need for this, but we really can't lose. I'm kind of stumbling over my words there. We can't lose sight of what we need to be doing, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And all of these kind of link back to what I was saying. You're encouraging public transport. You're reducing car dependency, and pretty much just links into everything I've already said. But why don't we do this? Why do we have a place like Denniston, which is the one on the left? Why do we? I mean, I'm sure you all know the answer already, but the reason, of course, is the Australian dream. So we as Australians very much romanticize the idea of living on a quarter-acre block in a house like this, and I'm definitely not immune to this. Like, I completely 100% get it. I live in a house myself, and I completely understand the appeal. Sometimes I genuinely feel very lucky to have enjoyed a growing up in a decently convenient area. I know, like, I've talked about how sprawling this place is and how it was pretty inconvenient as a child, but admittedly, I do feel grateful to not be even further from the city. I mean, West Pennant Hills is still only about an hour or so from the city. But point being, I'm kind of rambling a bit. The point is, we all romanticize the idea of the quarter-acre block, because historically, living in apartments, living in cities, was kind of seen as more for the lower class. We thought of it as dirty, grimy slums. And this perception still exists all over society. We fear losing privacy. We fear tall buildings. We fear traffic on the roads. I do also think that real estate speculation also plays a large role, and I can't just ignore that. Apartments don't appreciate as much as houses. I, don't believe that we should be just buying real estate purely for it to go up in price, but that's simply kind of just the fact of the matter is that that's just what's happening. So I'm just kind of admitting that that is also a big part of why houses are so much more attractive. I can't just ignore that, because I do admit that a lot of people would probably be happier with apartments if they saw it as a good investment or whatever. But yeah, those are all the reasons why we're still ending up with places like Denniston, and of course places like, did I have it? Yeah, places like Schofields. That's Schofields there. So yeah, so I kind of wanted to now touch on Singapore. My family is Singaporean Indian, and I go back to Singapore a lot, and I've always kind of used it on my YouTube channel as the golden example, like kind of the gold standard for what Australia should be aiming for. 7 in 10 Singaporeans live just a 10-minute walk from their local MRT station. And that's due to transit-oriented development. Very good transit-oriented development. In this picture, we have Jurong East, and you can just see like the beautiful kind of like twilight with the apartments and Jurong East MRT station. It's very good integrated development. They do have Dennistons, don't get me wrong. They're just not the majority, unlike Sydney. Like here, we have Chatswood, we have Hurstville, we have Walleye Creek, we have Parramatta. We have all of these examples, but I could probably list only about 20. In Singapore, it's pretty much every single station is like that, except for a few. And as a result of that, you always have people around them, and they are alive and vibrant with hawkers and shops and so much more. But again, this is an environmental conference, so let's go back to the true crux of things. 55.7% of journeys to work are made by public transport in Singapore. It's only 22.7% in Sydney, so more than double, and they are trying to get that up to 75%. And Singapore's not even the best example, mind you. It's just the one I know the most about. Hong Kong is like above 90%. So Hong Kong is like on another level, even more incredible than Singapore. So we can definitely do this. And I've just got a small thing there. Car taxes do play a role in Singapore as well. And I think we should definitely be considering adding more car taxes. I just don't quite think we're at that point yet. I don't think it would be fair to someone who lives in Marsden Park that their car that gets taxed because they already live there. I guess my point more is that we need to be kind of focusing more on positive reinforcement, and then the negative reinforcement can come when Australia is at a point where everyone can actually use public transport. And the thing is that Singapore is so much smaller than Sydney. I don't feel like we actually appreciate this. So I got this little map. There's about 5.5 million people in both cities, and yet look at that, how much people just fit into that city. Pretty much the entire, this is all of Sydney, this is where everyone lives, and all of that fits into this. And as a result, everyone lives closer to work. Everyone lives closer to schools. Everyone lives closer to each other. Places are more alive and bustling. There's a lot more social cohesion. Singapore, like, again, I don't know as much about Singapore as I do about Sydney, but from what I can tell, Singapore does not have bubbles the way that Sydney has its bubbles. It has the northern people who live in the northern beaches stay there. People who live in the Sutherland Shire stay there. People who live in the hills stay there. We've got these pockets where people tend to just kind of stick to their crowd. Don't quote me, but as far as I know, Singapore is got a lot more cohesion because, it's got such an excellent public transport network that, really does demolish the tyranny of distance. And yeah, Singapore's MRT network is just incredible. I'll give you a moment to look at that while I take a quick drink. All right. So I think I've spoken for about 25 minutes. So I think that's my last slide. So I'll wind up here. So we all know the solutions. I've kind of talked a lot about it today. First of all, we need to be building more metros. There's no doubt about that. It's definitely not the only thing we need to be doing, but I'd be lying if I said we shouldn't be building more metros. More light rail as well. I'm sure many of you saw the Parramatta Road light rail proposal a few months ago. We also need to be doing better investment in last mile transit for people who live in places like Marsden Park, around the Hills District, in my area, because as great as the metro is for my area, most people have to drive to the metro stations. And that doesn't make any sense to me because metros are meant to be places you get to by public transport. You shouldn't need to drive at all, because if you need to drive to the metro station, it doesn't matter how amazing the metro is, you need to own a car. What a waste of money for you if you need to own a car just because there's no buses to your metro station. So we need to be investing in better last mile transit. That will help discourage people from buying more cars. I'm sure many of you have heard about Chris Minns' transport-oriented development program, but for those of you who aren't familiar, our Premier Chris Minns has pretty much said, let's upzone all of these stations, let's make them denser, let's allow more development, build up into the sky that reduces the destruction of existing habitats, that reduces car dependency, which reduces transport emissions, etc., etc. Of course, it's been a bit controversial, but for the most part, I feel like most Sydney-siders are either ambivalent or supportive, and I'm obviously strongly supportive. A bit more of an underrated solution would be marketing. So channels like my YouTube channel, TikTok accounts as well, and so on, do play a big role in making public transport more appealing. When I was young, there was not really a channel like mine. TikTok wasn't really a thing. So I didn't really realize the benefits of public transport. So I think that actually does play a big role in teaching the adults of tomorrow, teaching kids right now that public transport is a genuine option. And on that note, trends are changing. Millennials and Zoomers are 62% of public transport patronage, but they're only 39% of the population. So things are changing. They are slowly shifting. We have to be patient because Rome wasn't built in a day. Neither was the Sydney Metro. We just have to simply keep kind of chipping away at this. And I reckon I'm pretty optimistic for the future. I mean, I don't think that Sydney-siders really actually appreciate just how good our public transport network is. And the Sydney Metro is making things even better. We have Sydney, we have another extension opening next year, another line out to the new airport opening the year after. We have the one to Parramatta opening in about 8 years. So we have a lot going on, and there's a lot to be excited for. I really feel like Sydney is on the right track, and I would, while I don't know as much about the other Australian cities, I would suspect they are also on the right track. So, let's allow public transport to bring us all closer together and solve a lot of the problems that car dependency has created. And yeah, that's my presentation. So I'll take questions now.